The Pacific Crest Trail has a reputation that borders on myth. Stretching more than 2,600 miles from the Mexican border up to Canada, it is both a test of endurance and a sanctuary for those seeking silence. For decades, it has pulled in adventurers, dreamers, and wanderers who want to trade the ordinary rhythm of life for the uncertainty of open miles. In February of 2015, it called to one man in particular, Chris Sylvia, a 28-year-old from Escondido, California, who seemed to fit perfectly into the profile of someone destined for the trail, but whose story would end in one of its most enduring mysteries. Chris was not the type who thrived in crowded cities or fast-paced social circles. Friends remembered him as soft-spoken, independent, and deeply reflective. He lived a quiet life, balancing odd jobs with long stretches of introspection. Hiking wasn't just a pastime for him, it was a philosophy. He found solace in wide landscapes where silence replaced small talk and the demands of modern life fell away. For Chris, the trail was not about reaching a finish line. It was about stripping away layers of distraction until only the essentials were left. Those who knew him understood he was not aimless, even if his life seemed unconventional. He studied Buddhism, practiced meditation, and often spoke about searching for meaning beyond material success. While some of his peers chased careers, Chris sought clarity. He wanted to test himself against nature's unpredictability, to prove he could live lightly, to rely on only what he could carry. That mindset made him particularly drawn to the Pacific Crest Trail, a path both beautiful and unforgiving. By February 2015, Chris had been planning a solo trek along the PCT for some time. He didn't intend to walk the entire route from Mexico to Canada. Instead, he wanted to explore sections near Southern California, particularly around Anza, a high desert town roughly 100 miles northeast of San Diego. The area's terrain was challenging. Rocky switchbacks, ridgelines that baked under the midday sun, and valleys where nighttime temperatures could drop with dangerous speed. But Chris had spent years preparing himself for this kind of environment. He owned gear, knew how to pack light, and had already covered long stretches of trail in the past. Nothing about this trip suggested he wasn't capable. On February 12, 2015, Chris set out on his journey. He had spoken with friends about his plan, and his confidence didn't raise alarms. The trip would not be a full-scale disappearance into the wilderness. He was supposed to be gone only a few days. His destination was not indefinite isolation. It was a meeting with friends at a Buddhist temple near Chihuahua Valley Road. Once he came down off the trail, he was known to carry his phone, and though service in the mountains was unreliable, he stayed in occasional contact. This wasn't a man looking to sever ties with the world completely. It was someone striking a balance between solitude and connection. The first days passed without issue. The Pacific Crest Trail south of Anza has a haunting beauty. Stretches of sand where the wind carves temporary patterns, jagged outcroppings that cast long shadows at dusk, and vast horizons that make a lone hiker seem impossibly small. Chris moved through this landscape deliberately, setting up his camps, carrying only what he needed, and pushing forward with the calm determination that friends said defined him. To those who knew him, it wasn't surprising. Chris had always lived with less. He was a minimalist long before the word became a cultural trend. His backpack contained essentials: a sleeping bag, pad, light food rations, and identification. His philosophy was not to overburden himself, physically or spiritually. That lifestyle, however, made his presence on the PCT more precarious than it might have been for others. When you strip down to the bare minimum, one misstep, a twisted ankle, a wrong turn, an unexpected storm, can become catastrophic. Still, during these early days of his hike, nothing pointed to danger. The PCT community often describes a meditative rhythm that develops after hours of walking. The crunch of boots on dirt, the rise and fall of breath, the shifting horizon ahead. Chris was in his element, immersed in that rhythm. The outside world continued on without him, but for Chris, each step was part of something deliberate, almost sacred. Even so, the choice to hike alone was not without risk. Most PCT hikers travel in pairs or small groups, partly for companionship but mostly for safety. Chris preferred solitude. He trusted himself, trusted his instincts, and believed the trail gave him what he was looking for: clarity without interference. But in doing so, he also placed himself beyond the safety net of others. In remote areas like Anza, help is not minutes away, can be hours, even days. That February, the desert was unpredictable. The days could warm quickly under direct sunlight, and the nights were brutally cold, with temperatures capable of dipping below freezing. Winds howled across ridges, stripping heat from anyone caught without shelter. While Chris had some experience in these conditions, survival required constant awareness, careful planning, and a margin of luck. For someone traveling alone, that margin was thin. Yet, if Chris feared any of this, he didn't show it. Before leaving, he had been in touch with his roommate and friends. He gave no indication of wanting to vanish, no hint of despair or recklessness. Everything pointed to a man pursuing his passion in a way he had done many times before. To him, the hike was part of a larger spiritual journey, one step closer to the clarity he sought. As Chris pressed deeper into the wilderness, he became just another figure swallowed by the immensity of the PCT. For those who later tried to retrace his path, this was the last moment where everything seemed ordinary. A man, his pack, and the trail stretching endlessly forward. No one could have predicted that within days, Chris Sylvia would stop being a hiker on a journey and instead become a mystery, one whose answers remain hidden in the silence of the Pacific Crest Trail. You're watching Trace of Evil, where we reveal true crimes, unsolved disappearances, and mysteries surrounding crime. Like and subscribe to watch more episodes from our channel. Let's get back into the story of Chris Sylvia. By the middle of February 2015, the rhythm of Chris Sylvia's hike should have carried him into the heart of Anza's backcountry. His plan was modest compared to the grand ambitions of full-length Pacific Crest Trail hikers. Chris had only carved out a small section to cover before meeting friends in the Chihuahua Valley area, a Buddhist retreat where he often spent time. The trail between Warner Springs and Anza was familiar territory for hikers, but also one of the most deceptive. The sweeping desert vistas gave way to rugged canyons, and the sense of isolation could turn dangerous with little warning. On February 16, 2015, for days after Chris had set off, his phone pinged a final time. He called a friend, briefly checking in. The conversation was short, uneventful, and gave no suggestion of distress. It was the kind of ordinary update that implied everything was proceeding as planned. After that call, Chris vanished from all lines of communication. No texts, no further calls, no sightings. His silence would soon become the first thread in a larger, far more troubling story. When Chris failed to arrive at the temple retreat, concern grew quickly. Those who knew him understood he valued solitude, but he was not reckless. His trips were usually short, and he maintained some level of contact. Days passed without a word. By February 20th, alarmed friends reported him missing. That triggered a chain reaction: a missing persons report filed, a search mobilized, and eventually a grim discovery. Searchers began combing through the terrain north of Warner Springs, following the Pacific Crest Trail's winding path through high desert ridges and scrubland. It didn't take long before they found something startling. Chris's campsite was abandoned, and his belongings were scattered. What made the discovery so unsettling was not just that he had left gear behind, but the specific items that were found. Laid out on the ground were his backpack, sleeping bag, pad, stove, and personal items, virtually everything he had carried into the wilderness. Missing only was Chris himself. The way the gear was positioned raised immediate questions. It didn't look like a hasty drop, nor the result of a fall. His sleeping bag and pad were spread as if they had been used. His backpack was nearby, zipped but not hidden. To the searchers, it appeared as though Chris had simply stepped away from camp, perhaps for a short errand, and never returned. The fact that he left his phone behind was particularly troubling. For most people, even those seeking solitude, the phone is both a lifeline and a tool for orientation. Chris's decision or circumstance to leave it behind created a scenario that defied easy explanations. Without it, there was no way for him to contact anyone, no digital breadcrumbs to follow. It was as though he had walked off into the desert intending only to be gone for moments, and then something irreversible happened. Authorities brought in search and rescue teams, helicopters, and tracking dogs. They swept the area surrounding the campsite, hoping to find footprints, discarded clothing, or any trace that might indicate where Chris had gone. But the landscape worked against them. The desert's shifting sands, high winds, and rocky surfaces quickly erased evidence. Days of searching yielded nothing. Not a single boot print led away from the site. It was as though Chris had evaporated into thin air. Investigators then began to ask deeper questions. Why would a seasoned hiker leave behind his gear in the first place? The pack wasn't light. It contained his survival essentials. Even if Chris had intended a short walk, it would have been unusual for him not to carry at least water. His water bottles were still with his gear, full. The scene challenged logic. The very items that gave him a chance at survival in the harsh desert were the ones he had abandoned. As news spread, the hiking community grew uneasy. The Pacific Crest Trail was a place known for its dangers, sudden storms, wildlife, and injuries. But the sheer absence of evidence in Chris's case made it different. Other hikers could recall falls, heat exhaustion, or disorientation. But in those situations, clues remained. Torn clothing, broken gear, or footprints. Chris's disappearance left none of that. Only his camp eerily intact. Meanwhile, Chris's family and friends were left to wrestle with questions that had no answers. Did he suffer a sudden medical emergency? Did he wander off in confusion? Was there an accident that searchers missed? Or more disturbingly, was foul play involved? Though rare, isolated trails can bring encounters with dangerous individuals. Yet if someone else had been involved, why leave his possessions behind? Why was nothing stolen or disturbed? As the days stretched into weeks, the official search scaled back. Helicopters stopped circling, and organized sweeps ended. But for Chris's loved ones, the void grew larger. Each theory they considered collapsed under scrutiny. If Chris had simply walked too far and become lost, rescuers should have found at least fragments of evidence. If he had collapsed from heatstroke or exposure, a body would eventually appear. Nothing did. The abandonment of the campsite became the haunting centerpiece of the case. Searchers could never shake the image of a lone sleeping bag laid across desert ground, a pack nearby, and silence all around. It was not the picture of a man prepared to disappear. It was the picture of someone interrupted, someone who had every intention of coming back. The disappearance quickly began to circulate beyond the local community. Hikers across forums debated what could have gone wrong. Some speculated that Chris might have had a sudden change of heart, choosing to leave his life behind voluntarily. But that idea clashed with his close ties to family and his openness about his journey. Others suggested disorientation or even a head injury, perhaps causing him to wander until he could no longer find his way back. Still, none of these theories reconciled with the lack of trace evidence. What remained was the chilling image of finality. A camp in the wilderness, possessions untouched, and a man who had simply ceased to exist. For those retracing his steps, it marked a point of no return in the mystery of Chris Sylvia. After February 16, 2015, the trail no longer held answers. It held only questions. The discovery of Chris Sylvia's abandoned gear set in motion one of the most extensive search operations ever undertaken in the Anza region. Once the San Diego County Sheriff's Department became involved, they deployed every available resource. Helicopters skimmed over ridgelines, thermal imaging was used to scan the rocky desert floor, and search and rescue teams methodically spread out in grid patterns. The harsh landscape, a mix of chaparral, arid valleys, and steep ridges, gave no indication of where Chris had gone. Tracking dogs were brought in, but they struggled against the environment. The terrain's dryness and shifting winds dissipated scents within hours. Even when dogs picked up faint trails, they ended abruptly, leaving searchers staring into miles of scrubland without direction. Unlike forested areas where broken branches or disturbed soil could suggest movement, the desert's rocky surfaces swallowed evidence. Search teams noted that it was as if Chris had stepped off the trail and dissolved into the environment. The official search ran from late February into early March 2015. For nearly 2 weeks, dozens of volunteers and professionals combed the region around the site. Despite their efforts, Not a single piece of evidence beyond his gear was ever recovered. No footprints, no torn clothing, no sign of an injury. Search leaders faced the grim truth. Without new leads, they were covering the same stretches of land without progress. By early March, the decision was made to scale back. The sudden end to organized searches left friends and family devastated. Chris's parents had clung to the hope that some sign, even a minor clue, would surface. Instead, they were left with silence. To them, it was inconceivable that someone so resourceful could vanish in such a complete way. They began coordinating smaller, independent searches. Local hikers joined, scouring canyons and ridgelines, but every outing ended the same way, empty-handed. In the weeks that followed, the case began to ripple beyond San Diego County. The Pacific Crest Trail community took notice. For those who hiked its long stretches, Chris's disappearance carried an almost mythic weight. The PCT was a place known for its challenges, but it also had an unspoken safety net. Hikers looked out for each other, word traveled quickly when someone was in trouble, and rescues, though difficult, were not unheard of. Chris's vanishing violated that expectation. His case quickly became a cautionary tale, shared on forums and discussed among long-distance hikers. Law enforcement faced a difficult dilemma. With no evidence of foul play, the case remained officially classified as a missing person investigation. Yet the abandoned gear suggested something far from ordinary. Detectives reviewed his final phone call, made on February 16th, but found nothing unusual. Chris hadn't expressed distress or a desire to change plans. They interviewed friends, roommates, and acquaintances, searching for hidden motives that might explain voluntary disappearance. They came up with little more than speculation. Theories began to swirl. The most immediate one was accident, that Chris had wandered from camp, slipped on rugged terrain, and succumbed to exposure or injury. But such a scenario should have left a trail. Disturbed brush, clothing, bones, or even his body. The absence of these undermined the theory. Another possibility raised was disorientation or a medical event. Dehydration, hypothermia, or a sudden collapse could have left him vulnerable. But again, search efforts would have uncovered remains within the radius of his camp. No trace was ever found. Then came the more unsettling theories. Some suggested Chris had chosen to vanish, abandoning his old life deliberately. But if that were the case, why leave his gear behind? His possessions were not scattered in haste. They were laid out in a way that suggested calm, routine use. For a man planning a disappearance, leaving identification, supplies, and shelter in the wilderness made little sense. The final theory was foul play. Some in the hiking community whispered about strangers on the trail, encounters gone wrong, or opportunistic violence. Yet investigators found no evidence of robbery or struggle. His belongings were intact, nothing appeared stolen, and there were no signs of conflict. As weeks turned into months, the case began to cool. Without new leads, investigators had little to act upon. The official file remained open, but activity slowed to a crawl. Friends and family continued to search sporadically, often retracing steps along the PCT, but they found only reminders of the futility, the vast emptiness of the desert swallowing all clues. By the summer of 2015, Chris's disappearance had become another mystery folded into the lore of the Pacific Crest Trail. Hikers shared his story as a warning of the trail's unforgiving nature. Online forums dissected every possibility, some arguing for logical explanations, others framing it as something inexplicable. For those who knew him, though, it was no abstract puzzle. It was the ongoing ache of absence, the daily confrontation with questions that had no answers. What made Chris's case so disturbing was not only that he vanished, but that he left behind a campsite that seemed frozen in time. Every item told a story of a man intending to return. His sleeping bag neatly placed, his backpack upright, his water untouched. It was a scene of interruption, not departure. For searchers who had walked those barren ridges, the image lingered. They spoke of the strangeness, of how the desert seemed to conspire in erasing him. For his family, it was worse. They were left holding onto the thought that somewhere beyond the reach of helicopters and search teams, Chris had simply ceased to exist in a way that defied all explanation. By the end of 2015, the silence surrounding his case was complete. What had begun as a missing person report had evolved into one of the PCT's most enduring mysteries. And for Chris Sylvia, the man who once walked into the desert with a backpack and a plan, the trail had become a boundary, the point where his story ended and speculation began. Law enforcement kept Chris's file open but inactive, labeling it a missing persons case with suspicious circumstances. Search and rescue veterans revisited the terrain multiple times, even using cadaver dogs and specialized drones as technology improved. Yet nothing surfaced. No bones, no scraps of clothing, not even a trace of a trail. It was as if the desert had swallowed Chris whole, erasing every sign of his existence past February 2015. For his friends, particularly those who had hiked with him in the past, the loss carried an edge of haunting. They replayed their last conversations, wondering if they had missed a warning sign, some flicker of intent in his words. Chris had been introspective, sometimes deeply philosophical, but not despairing. He had dreams of finishing the trail, of building a life beyond it. Nothing suggested he had planned an abrupt exit from the world. As the years went on, new hikers walked the stretch of the Pacific Crest Trail where Chris was last seen. Many passed by without realizing the landscape held a ghost story. Some who learned of it would pause, taking in the emptiness of the desert, considering how a man could disappear so completely under the open sky. Chris's case became one of the PCT's cautionary tales, a reminder that even experienced hikers can vanish in an instant, leaving behind more questions than answers. For his family, the disappearance remains a wound without closure. Each anniversary of his vanishing brings renewed pain, the ache of not knowing. His mother has spoken of the quiet devastation of everyday life, of how the absence infiltrates simple routines. The empty chair at family gatherings, the phone that will never ring. Without remains, without evidence, grief remains suspended, always tangled with the cruel uncertainty of what if. The desert itself looms as a character in this tragedy. Vast, unyielding, and merciless, it has devoured countless lives over centuries. Indigenous travelers, pioneers, migrants, wanderers. To those who know it well, the desert offers beauty and silence, but also danger. To the unprepared, or even to the experienced who miscalculate, it can be a final resting place without a grave. Chris became part of that long lineage of the missing, another story whispered into the arid winds of Anza-Borrego. Nearly a decade later, his disappearance endures as one of the most unsettling mysteries tied to the Pacific Crest Trail. His name circulates among hikers and investigators alike, a cautionary echo. Chris Sylvia, the man who walked into the desert and never came out. For those left behind, the mystery is a prison of speculation. Without answers, they can never truly grieve, never truly move on.